Dragon Quest 1 and 2 HD-2D Remake is a mouthful of a name. That aside, a huge thank you to Square Enix for providing me with a copy for review. This video follows on from my previous review of last year's Dragon Quest 3 HD-2D Remake, where you might be wondering, why exactly did Square drop that game before they dropped the remakes of 1 and 2, which I'll dive into in just a second. But for reference, I did play this on the PS5, that's the gameplay you're seeing, and we played it on the graphics mode, not the performance mode. So to explain, we kind of have to step back and look at all three games here. They effectively tie into what's called the Erdrick trilogy, which is a story arc about the hero Erdrick. Dragon Quest 3 technically is the first game chronologically, which is why they released that game or that remake first. You are literally put into the shoes of the hero Erdrick, son of the famous warrior Ortega, who basically goes on to defeat evil and save the world of Elfgard. There are some more twists and turns, and though that story is simple, it still is quite enjoyable, but Dragon Quest 1 is somewhat the middle child here, where you play the descendant of Erdrick basically years later. Evil is once more on the rise, and it is up to you to basically take on the mantle of hero, fight against the forces of darkness, save Elfgard, and also at the same time rescue Princess Gwaelin. And if you want to take a look at Dragon Quest 2, you can kind of guess where this is going. You are yet again thrust into the mantle of a descendant of Erdrick, or descendants, I should say, this time many years later. And, surprise, surprise, evil is once again on the rise, and it's up to you to put a stop to it. That's basically the story of the Erdrick trilogy in a nutshell in these games. I am paraphrasing and summarizing quite heavily here, but what I will say is that having played 3, I do get a little bit additional context, which makes, 1 and 2 that much more enjoyable, but I will say that you don't have to have played 3 before these two. So how exactly do these games play? Well, considering that they're supposed to be RPGs from the late 80s, I want to say they're rather straightforward. You are put into the shoes of the hero, whoever that may be. You are given effectively a task to complete, and then you are basically set upon the world to go and find out what it is you need to be doing. Whether it's, talking to NPCs, exploring mysterious caverns and dungeons, traversing the overworld, facing enemies, going off to inns to recuperate or purchase items, everything you can expect to do in an RPG, you're basically going to encounter here. And if you've played the Dragon Quest 3 remake, then a lot of this will seem very familiar to yourself. As somebody who's only dabbled in Dragon Quest previously, with my experiences being with 8, which I think is one that a lot of people have played, one of the most popular and most beloved, and also 9, Sentinels of the Starry Sky, I wasn't necessarily quite so sure as to what to expect with these games, particularly because they're from an era before myself. But considering the amount of quality of life features that Square Enix have actually put into these games, I found them actually quite palatable. Before we dive into some of those quality of life features though, I do want to talk about some of the additions to the game that they've made that, if you're a hardcore fan of these games, will feel new to you and go beyond just quality of life. The first of which is they've kind of reworked a little bit of the combat in Dragon Quest 1. You're able to fight basically more than one monster at a time now, bringing it more up to speed with the rest of the Dragon Quest games from this era. You have new dungeons basically to explore, which again, if you know the original like the back of your hand, this adds a little bit of spice into the mix. And then they've kind of reworked a little bit of the story here and there and provided actually a few new additional scenarios, without saying too much, to help keep you on your toes. On the flip side of that coin, you now have access to a playable Princess Canuck, which I thought was a no-brainer, but apparently it wasn't a thing in the original. Cool to see it happen here though, and I want to say the game, and the story in particular, has been expanded and lengthened compared to the original, with additional locations and stories to basically encounter. As somebody new to these games, that was definitely reflected in my playing experience. Dragon Quest 1 was basically a blitz to kind of go through, very short, so if you're looking to dip your toes into this kind of game, it took me, I want to say, around 10 to 12 hours. Dragon Quest 2, on the other hand, took, I want to say, 3 to 4 times that. I can't remember what my total runtime was, but it was between 30 to 40 hours, and that was without sort of diving all too much into some of the additional content that you can encounter. So if you play through 1 and fall in love with the formula, you definitely have a lot more to look forward to with 2. There are a few additional systems that they've managed to work across both titles, some of which were in the previous Dragon Quest III remake, like the scroll system, allowing you to instantly learn abilities at the cost of using up an item, or the mini medals, where you're basically kind of incentivized to explore, where you can find specific medals and then bring them to a vendor for some sweet gear. The second edition, which wasn't in 3 Remake, took me a little bit by surprise, and that was the sigil system. There are sigils that you can basically put together or find, which can alter how combat plays out, like buffing your attacks, for example, if you're under a specific amount of health, or, having an increased chance to crit, a nice layer to the combat without being too overbearing or too overpowered. Speaking of the combat in these games, they are very straightforward and simple. You basically take turns attacking or defending, or using abilities and spells during combat against a myriad of different foes. In Dragon Quest I, you only control one character, being the hero. In Dragon Quest II, you control a party. Very similar to 3 Remake if you've played that, but this is turn-based combat. They're not reinventing the wheel here. What you see is what you get. But I will say, and I've said this before, this is very much a classic RPG, which means that if you don't know the strategy for specific enemies or bosses in particular, or if you're not leveled enough, you're basically going to get absolutely cooked. At which point your only, course of action is to either lower the difficulty, which will definitely help, or you can go out there and grind, which is basically what the game wants you to do. And considering this is a game where you have random encounters, it's always best to make sure that you're not skipping too many. You want to stay leveled enough to where you're not getting destroyed by the standard enemies in any given area, where you have your standard objective. And I'd honestly recommend that you make use of the holy water item as much as you can. It basically removes enemies that are lower level than you from triggering a random encounter, ensuring that the fights that you do take on are efficient from an XP standpoint. Stepping away from the combat entirely though, let's talk about some of those quality of life features that I alluded to earlier in this video, which, considering what they've done here, I think is definitely worth talking about. First and foremost, they have an autosave. It sounds so ridiculous to say that out loud, but considering that you can only manually save at specific places like churches, for example, it makes this very easy to basically pick up and put down as needed. You've got the ability to select a difficulty. Again, I know it sounds very basic, but considering this game can be quite brutal at times, considering it's a classic RPG in and of itself, you also have the option to have the game show which attacks your enemies are vulnerable to. You've got to fast forward during combat. You've even got the ability to use auto combat if you just want the game to play as you dictate. And if you've played the previous remake of 3, these will obviously sound very familiar. You've even got things like voice acting making a return, which I thought was a really nice touch. You've also got things like map markers, so you know where you're going at all times if basically meandering around isn't something that you like to do. But then you've also got a very well detailed compendium of tooltips to basically guide you through combat and the game itself if you're struggling, and the well-beloved recall function, which allows you to basically save whatever conversation you previously had to ensure that you don't miss out on information. As I mentioned, this is very much still, a classic RPG through and through. You will have to basically speak to characters who will give you information, and at times you might need to basically refer back to it so you don't get confused. So having the option to basically save it and then recall it at any point is super useful. Before we wrap up the video here, one thing I have to talk about is the game's presentation. As I mentioned in my review of 3 and other sort of RPGs like Octopath Traveler, the HD-2D approach here is absolutely fantastic. I'm a sucker for the art style, so for me it really resonates well, and it's great to see them continue on with that process with the remakes of 1 and 2. It feels like they've done a really good job of remaining faithful to the originals, whilst also not overdoing it. I think you can see it a lot in some of the Octopath Traveler games. People complain about the sheer amount of depth of field that they've got in some of the scenes here, where here I think it's used quite tastefully to pull focus only when needed. Moving away from the visual aspect, we also have to talk about the audio. Not just the voice acting, which I think does a good job of layering and adding to the story, but also just the soundtrack across both games, which I believe was performed by the Tokyo Metropolitan Symphony. RPGs are definitely one of the only genres, at least for me, where the music can very much be make or break when it comes to it being a memorable title. The final verdict. What did I think of the games? Honestly, as somebody who liked 3 and somebody who just likes RPGs in general, I really liked 1 and 2 here. It's very much more of the same, if that makes sense. It's iterative in some instances, but it's more of the same, and that can be both either, good or bad depending on who you are. If you're not a fan of the classic RPG formula, you're kind of going to find more of that here, so this probably isn't one that you want to sort of step into. But if you are a fan of RPGs, then I definitely recommend you give it a try. As I mentioned, there's more than enough quality of life features they've added here to bring this up to more of a contemporary standard and just make it a lot more accessible in general. And with that, we come to the end of today's video. Let me know down in the comments below what you think of the Dragon Quest series, and with all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.